Time to get started on this Princeton reissue that's going to get some updates. First thing to do is I loosen that ground connection over here and remove the bias pot so that the board can lift up after these are all pulled out. But before I do that, I want to do some things where I have some mechanical. I like to have the board in place for some mechanical support first. So start with these filter caps. And I've got to look at the schematics, see which are the screen grid resistors at some of these here. I want to move those to the tube sockets. I had to get in here and get rid of some of these zip ties. They're a bit overzealous in their zip tying. All right, the green wires are the heaters. They're right here. I want to disconnect those without disturbing all the other stuff. It's a little bit tricky with it all bundled like this. I'm going to fish the green ones out of that cluster. These will have the quick connect snipped off, and then the wires run and soldered directly to this octal socket right here, like on the 60s amps, and that'll give a much more reliable connection without any heat damage. All right. Time to start pulling the board. So screws, disconnect these, the whole thing should lift up. So while I'm going to do this on every one of these, I'm just going to show you on one because it's a pain in the butt to work here with the camera in the way. But this is one of the leads of the old filter caps. I've applied some fresh solder to the other side to remind the old solder that it is indeed solder. I actually add some flux to it. Heat it up quickly and push it down. And at that point, it'll just push on through and come out. And the reason I want to do that is the old leg was bent over. If I try to unbend it from this side, it can put stress on that pad. If I try to pull it up from the top side, it would rip up that pad. So I just snip it off the top so that there's no obstruction, push it through, then that little hook does not make any difference at all. Once I get the old component leg out, just use a little bit of braid. This braid has flux built into it. For the millionth time, I use Tech Spray number 4 No Clean. And at that point, there is no solder on that pad. It's very clean, and the meter agrees, and it is ready. After I hit it with a little bit of ISO to get the old flux off, it'll be ready for new solder. So let me do that to all the ones I'm removing, and then we'll resume. All right, well, it's all been recapped. New MODs, bumped this one up to 40. The screen grid resistors, which were here and here, have been moved to the octal sockets. The heater wires, which used to go here, were moved to the octal sockets. The heater balance resistors, which can burn the board, were removed, moved to the octal sockets. I know it's repetitive, but it's important. Some other tweaks were made to the phase inverter to give this amp some more clean headroom than most Princetons have. That's beyond the scope of this video, but it sounds nice. The issue I ran into when I got it to this point was I went to check the bias, and the bias was about 75 to 80%. I thought, well, that's not good. Let me turn on the bias pot, which is over here. And I found that the bias was already set to its most minimum. And I thought, well, okay, those old JJs may be faulty. I took out the JJs, put in a brand new known good pair of TAD red base 636s, exact same behavior. Measured everything in the bias circuit, et cetera, et cetera. Took me a while to figure it out. It was the old Sovtech rectifier tube, the GZ34 5AR4. The Princeton takes its bias tap off one side of the HT secondary. And if anything's screwy with the current at that tube, it will draw down the voltage at that bias. And that was the case, which is why the bias trim pot at its most counterclockwise was still too hot for tubes. So right now, I've got a different temp gen Sovtech 5AR4 that I had in another amp here for test purposes. And with the bias at its most negative, it's now at about 55% idle, which means that it's still a little bit hotter than designed. The trim pot at its most negative should be much colder than you'd want to operate, and you'd typically run a Princeton Reverb reissue with that trim pot somewhere in the middle of its range. but I'm going to defer that until the new rectifier tube arrives because, like I said, the one that's in here is not original to the amp and it's used. So let me give you a quick idea that the amp is actually sounding quite nice. If I can rotate so where I'm not getting hum on the pickup. One of the things I did in this amp was I deepened the tremolo, which gets that real nice chewy range. It can be a little bit subtle in stock form. There's a little tiny bit of a low impulse at this setting. That just means that you would turn it down until you don't get that pulse, and there you go. Anytime you have a bias trim, there's always some little trade-off, but it's working quite well. The amp has two new 12AX7s and a new 12AT7, and we'll soon have a new rectifier tube and a mids pot added. Want to make sure everything else was healthy before I put in the mids pot. And it's getting a new reverb tank because the old one was kaput. So this will probably be done tomorrow or Monday, depending on when the new tube arrives. But that was with the volume on 3, and that's fairly loud in the room. Granted, that's a 2x12, not the single 10 it comes with, but still, if I have the volume here at 2, that's about where a lot of Princetons are at 4. The tweaks I made to the phase inverter really give it a lot more output and clarity. And not just output, but clean output. And the transition from clean to breakup is nicer. But I'll show you that in the last video I do on this, where we'll play it with a real mic. Because if I turn it up now, it'll just clip this little lav mic, and that's not much fun for anyone.